What's up everyone, welcome. Today we are starting the Psychological Experiments Iceberg. In this iceberg we'll be covering everything from psychological tests all the way up to borderline mind control type of experiments. So if any of that sounds interesting, make sure you stick around for the next few parts. This is probably going to be around 6. Also make sure you subscribe, like, all that YouTube stuff, and finally thank you for watching, appreciate it. Okay, so we're actually starting this iceberg off in the sky. We're not even at the tip yet. So starting off is Pavlov's dog. Now Pavlov's dog's experiments played a critical role in the discovery of one of the most important concepts in psychology, classical conditioning. Now, while it actually happened by accident, Pavlov's famous experiments had a major impact on our understanding of how learning actually takes place, as well as the development of the school of behavioral psychology. Classical conditioning is sometimes called Pavlovian conditioning. So, how did experiments on the digestive response in dogs lead to one of the most important discoveries in psychology? Ivan Pavlov was a noted Russian psychologist who won the 1904 Nobel Prize for his work studying digestive processes. While studying digestion in dogs, Pavlov noticed an interesting occurrence. His canine subjects would begin to salivate whenever an assistant entered the room. The concept of classical conditioning is studied by every entry-level psychology student, so it may be surprising to learn the man who first noted this phenomenon was not a psychologist at all. In his digestive research, Pavlov and his assistants would introduce a variety of edible and non-edible items and measure the saliva production that the items produced. Salivation, he noted, is a reflexive process. It occurs automatically in response to a specific stimulus and is not under conscious control at all. However, Pavlov noted that the dogs would often begin salivating in the absence of food and smell. He quickly realized that the salivation response was not due to an automatic physiological process. Based on his observations, Pavlov suggested that the salivation was a learned response. Pavlov's dog subjects were responding to the sight of the research assistant's white lab coats, which the animals had come to associate with the presentation of food. So basically, anytime they seen the white lab coats, they thought they were getting food. Unlike the salivary response to the presentation of food, which is an unconditional reflex, salivating to the expectation of food is a conditioned reflex, so that's the complete difference of it. Pavlov then focused investigating exactly how these conditioned responses are learned or acquired. In a series of experiments, he set out to provoke a conditioned response to a previously neutral stimulus. He opted to use food as the unconditioned stimulus, or the stimulus that evokes a response naturally and automatically. The sound of a metronome was chosen to be the neutral stimulus. The dogs would first be exposed to the sound of a ticking metronome, then the food would be immediately presented. After several conditioning trials, Pavlov noted that the dogs began to salivate after hearing the metronome, a stimulus which was neutral and of itself had been superimposed upon the action of the inborn alimentary reflex, Pavlov wrote in his results. So that was his exact words. Pavlov wrote of the results, "We observed that after several repetitions of the combined stimulation, the sounds of the metronome have acquired the property of stimulating salivatory secretion. In other words, the previously neutral stimulus, or the metronome, had become what is known as the conditioning stimulus, and then is provoked a conditioned response, or the salivation." Pavlov's discovery of classical conditioning remains one of the most important in psychology's history. In addition to forming the basis of what would become behavioral psychology, the classical conditioning process remains important today for numerous applications, including behavioral modification, mental health treatments, including phobias, anxiety, and panic disorders. So it's still super relevant today, and basically every entry-level psychology major or whatever learns about it. So we're moving on to the next one though.
Hey Pavlov, you dog-teasing dick! How's this for positive reinforcement?
Up next is Skinner's box. The Skinner box is a chamber that isolates the subject from the external environment and has a behavioral indicator such as a lever or a button, so one or the other. When the animal pushes the button or lever, the box is able to deliver a positive reinforcement of the behavior, such as food, or a punishment, such as a noise, or a token conditioner, such as a light. This is correlated with either the positive reinforcement or punishment. So the real question is, how does it work? The Skinner box is a chamber, often small, that is used to conduct operant conditioning research with animals. Within this chamber, there is usually a lever or a key that an individual animal can operate to obtain food or a water source within the chamber as a reinforcer. The chamber is connected to an electronic equipment that records the animal's lever pressing or key pecking, allowing for the precise quantification of the behavior. Before the works of Skinner, who is the namesake of the Skinner box, instrumental learning was typically studied using a maze or a puzzle box. Now, learning in these settings is well suited to examining discrete trials or episodes of behavior instead of continuous streams of behavior. Meanwhile, the Skinner box was designed as an experimental environment better suited to examine the more natural flow of behavior in animals. Modified versions of the operant conditioning chamber or Skinner box are still widely used in research settings today. Skinner developed his theory of operant conditioning by identifying 4 different types of punishment or reward. To test the effect of these outcomes, he constructed a device called the Skinner box, a cage which a rat could be placed with a small lever which the rat would already be trained to press, a chute which would release pellets of food, and a floor which could be electrified. For example, a hungry rat was placed in a cage. Every time he activated the lever, a food pellet fell in the food dispenser, which is a positive reinforcement. The rats quickly learned to go straight to the lever after a few times of being put inside the box. This suggests that positive reinforcement increases the likelihood of behavior being repeated. In a different experiment, a rat was placed in a cage in which they were subjected to an uncomfortable electrical current. As he moved around the cage, the rat hit the lever. This immediately switched off the electrical current, which is a negative reinforcement. The rats quickly learned to go straight to the lever after a few times of being put in the box. Now, this suggests that negative reinforcement increases the likelihood of the behavior also being repeated, so both do the same exact thing. Now, the device allowed Skinner to deliver each of his 4 potential outcomes, which are positive reinforcement, a direct reward for performing a certain behavior. For instance, the rat could be rewarded with a pellet of food for pushing the lever. A positive punishment, a direct negative outcome following a particular behavior. Once the rat had been taught to press the lever, for instance, Skinner trained it to cease this behavior by electrocuting the floor each time the lever was pressed. Negative reinforcement, the removal of an unpleasant situation when a particular behavior is performed, thus producing a sense of relief. For instance, a mild electric current being passed through the floor was removed when the desired behavior was performed. And finally, negative punishment involves taking away a reward or removing a pleasant situation. In the Skinner box, for instance, the rat can be trained to stop pressing the lever by releasing food pellets at regular intervals and then withholding them whenever the lever was actually pressed. Now, the application of operant and classical conditioning and the corresponding idea of the Skinner box in commercial settings is widespread, particularly with regard to advertising and to video games. Advertisers use a number of techniques based on operant conditioning to influence consumer behavior, such as variable ratio reinforcement schedule, the so-called slot machine effect, gambling meta, whatever you want to call it, which encourages viewers to keep watching a particular channel in the hopes of seeing a desirable outcome, or loot boxes, loot crates, whatever else. You know the deal. Now, one famous myth surrounding the Skinner family is that the Skinner's daughter, Deborah Skinner, was actually raised in a Skinner box.
What the hell?
Crazy, right? Now, according to this rumor, Deborah Skinner had become mentally ill, sued her father, and committed suicide as a result of her experience. These rumors persisted until she publicly denied the stories in 2004. Crazy, they literally thought this lady grew up in one of these trained conditioning boxes. Good thing she actually came out and let people know that this was not true, because if not, I'm sure the internet would have believed this thing forever. But we're moving on to the next one. Up next are the Sally Ann experiments. For decades, developmental psychologists have been fascinated with the question of how children develop theory of mind. In other words, how we come to understand that other people can have different types of thoughts, beliefs, and knowledge different to ourselves. A key milestone in this journey involves developing a notion of false belief. Sometimes the things that people believe about the world are very different from the reality of the situation, and this will have important consequences for how people actually act. But how do you measure something so seemingly esoteric? Beginning in 1983, a series of studies used fictional scenarios to try and assess at what age children start to get a grasp of the existence of false beliefs. Perhaps the most influential of these experiments is known as the Sally Ann task, developed by Simon Baron Cohen, Alan Leslie, and Uta Frith. In the experiment, children were presented with 2 dolls, Sally, who has a basket, and Ann, who has a box. Sally puts a marble in her basket and leaves the room. While Sally is away, Ann takes the marble from the basket and hides it in her box. Finally, Sally returns to the room and the child is asked 3 questions. Where will Sally look for her marble? The belief question. Where is the marble really? The reality question. Where was the marble at the beginning? The memory question. The critical question is the belief question. If the children answer this by pointing to the basket, then they have shown an appreciation of what Sally's understanding of the world doesn't reflect the actual states of affairs. If they instead point to the box, they then fail the task, arguably because they haven't taken into account that they possess knowledge that Sally doesn't have access to.
Retard. Retard. Retard.
The findings were comparable for the typically developing children and those with Down syndrome. In both groups, around 85% of participants correctly answered the belief question. Now, for the children with autism, the pass rate was much lower at 20%. For the 80% that failed the task, they consistently pointed to the actual location of the marble. More broadly, other studies have shown that 4-year-olds tend to get the idea that Sally will look in the basket, whereas 3-year-olds instead point to the box. So that 1 year really makes a difference. At this early age then, children seem to show a difficulty in understanding that other people might have different levels of knowledge to them, and that will therefore behave differently to them in the same exact situation. Since its publication in 1985, the Sally Ann study has spawned a huge research literature looking at how theory of mind develops in different populations at different stages. And that was all I could really find for that one. If you have anything else on that one, let me know below, but I think I pretty much covered that one fully. So moving on to the next one. Okay, next up is the Piaget conservation experiment. Conservation refers to the logical thinking ability that allows a person to determine that a certain quantity will remain the same despite adjustment of the container, shape, or apparent size, according to psychologist Jean Piaget. His theory poses that the ability is not present in children during the pre-operational stage of their development around ages 2 to 7, but instead develops in the concrete operational stage from around 7 to 11. Conservation task tests a child's ability to see that some properties are conserved or invariant after an object undergoes physical transformation. The following tasks also explain the different types of conservation. Piaget proposed that children's inability to conserve is due to a weakness in the way that children think during the pre-operational stage, or like I said, around 2 to 7. The following tasks also explain the different types of conservation. Piaget proposed that children's inability to conserve is due to a weakness in the way that children think during the pre-operational stages. This stage of cognitive development is characterized by children focusing on a single salient dimension of height or length, while ignoring other important attributes of the object. Piaget's other famous task to test for the conservation of liquid involves showing a child 2 beakers, A1 and A2, which are identical and which the child agrees contains the same amount of colored liquid. The liquid from beaker A1 is poured into a taller, thinner glass, B1. The child is then asked whether there is still the same amount of liquid in each of the new glasses, B1 and B2, as was in beakers A1 and A2. A child who cannot conserve would answer no, there is more in the tall, thin glasses, while a child who can conserve would answer yes, there is still the same amount of liquid in both. Now, Piaget also replicated this task with beads in glasses and found again that some children were able to conserve while others were not. The ages at which children were able to complete conservation tasks varies. Individual differences can cause some children to develop the ability earlier or later than others. Also, age can vary across different countries and continents. However, most children are not able to perform the conservation of number task correctly from ages 4 to 5. And most children develop the ability from actual ages 6 to 8. That's when most people end up getting the ability to do this. Conservation of mass and length occurs around age 7, and conservation of weight around age 9. And then finally, the conservation of volume around age 11. Piaget's studies of conservation led him to observe the stages which children pass through when gaining the ability to conserve. In the first stage, children do not yet have the ability to conserve. During the conservation of liquid task, children will respond that a liquid in a tall glass always has more liquid than that of a short glass, because they cannot discern height from the amount. In the second stage, children expand their judgments in the conservation of liquid tasks to also include width as a reason. They may answer that a shorter, stouter glass has more liquid than a tall, skinny glass. In the third stage, children have gained the ability to conserve and recognize that height and width do not affect the amount. Conservers believe more firmly in their answers on conservation tasks when paired with non-conservers as partners, and they are able to offer multiple explanations and are more likely to manipulate the task materials to prove their point than non-conservers. Most studies indicate that conservation occurs in a similar sequence and at similar ages across cultures, but that there are differences in the rate at which conservation and other cognitive abilities are acquired across cultures. For example, one study examining US and Zambian female adolescents found no difference in their ability to answer questions indicating the ability to conserve in conservation of weight and mass tests. Another study looked at children from many countries including Australia, Netherlands, England, New Zealand, Poland, and Uganda, and tested for the ages at which conservation appeared. They found that the rate at which children acquired conservation varied slightly in different countries, but that the age trends for when conservation develops are similar across borders despite cultural upbringings. Now, research has also examined whether non-human primates are able to conserve. Chimpanzees are able to make judgments on whether two quantities of liquid are the same or different, and they are able to conserve correctly when liquids are transformed based on inferences. They are also able to correctly conserve for solid quantities, but they are not able to demonstrate conservation of number. And also, orangutans are able to differentiate between the same and different quantities of liquid, but they are only able to pseudo-conserve in manner of similar to children in the second stage of conservation development, and ultimately fail to demonstrate complete conservation of liquids. So we're moving on to the next one. That was a whole bunch of information. So quick question. Do you think you're a sheep? Do you follow what people just say blindly, or do you just follow whatever you like to do? You know what I mean? If you think something is wrong, are you gonna go against the group, or are you just gonna do whatever they say?
Because I want to fit in.
That is the exact premise of this next entry, the Asch-Conformity Experiments. The Asch-Conformity Experiments were a series of psychological experiments conducted by Solomon Asch in the 1950s. The experiments revealed the degree to which a person's own opinions are influenced by those of a group. Asch found that people were willing to ignore reality and give an incorrect answer in order to conform to the rest of the group. Pretty interesting stuff. Most people believe that they are nonconformist enough to stand up to a group when they know that they are right, but conformist enough to blend in with the rest of their peers. Imagine yourself in this situation. You've signed up to participate in a psychology experiment in which you are asked to complete a vision test. Seated in a room with the other participants, you are shown a line segment and then are asked to choose the matching line from a group of 3 segments of different lengths. The experimenter asks each participant individually to select the matching line segment. On some occasions, everyone in the group chooses the correct line, but occasionally, the other participants unanimously declare that a different line is actually the correct match. So what do you do when the experimenter asks you which line is the right one? Do you go with your initial response, or do you choose to conform with the rest of the group and pick the wrong answer? Asch's experiments involved having people who were in on the experiment pretending to be regular participants along with those who were actual unaware subjects of the study. Those that were in on the experiment would behave in certain ways to see if their actions had an influence on the actual experiment participants. All told, a total of 50 students were part of Asch's experimental condition. There were 18 different trials in the experimental condition, and the conformists gave incorrect responses in 12 of them, which Asch referred to as the critical trials. The purpose of these critical trials was to see if the participants would change their answer in order to conform to how the others in the group responded. The study also included 37 participants in a control condition in order to ensure that the average person could accurately gauge the length of the lines. The control group was asked to individually write down the correct math. According to these results, participants were very accurate in their line judgments, choosing the correct answer 99% of the time. And nearly 75% of the participants in the conformity experiments went along with the rest of the group at least one time. The experiments also looked at the effect that the number of people present in the group had on conformity. When just one conformist was present, there was virtually no impact on participants' answer. The presence of 2 conformists had only a tiny effect, and the level of conformity seen at 3 or more conformists was far more significant. Asch also found that having one of the conformists give the correct answer while the rest of the conformists gave the incorrect answer dramatically lowered conformity. In this situation, just 5 to 10% of participants conformed to the rest of the group, depending on how often the ally answered correctly. Later studies have also supported this finding, suggesting that having social support is an important tool in combating conformity. At the conclusion of the Asch experiments, participants were asked why they had gone along with the rest of the group. In most cases, the students stated that while they knew the rest of the group was wrong, they did not want to risk facing ridicule. A few of the participants suggested that they had actually believed that the other members of the group were correct in their answers. Asch went on to conduct further experiments in order to determine which factors influence how and when people conform. He found that conformity tends to increase when more people are present. However, there is little change once the group size goes beyond 4 or 5 people. Conformity also increases when the task becomes more difficult. In the face of uncertainty, people turn to others for information on how to respond. Conformity also increases when other members of the group are of higher social status. When people view the others in the group as more powerful, influential, or knowledgeable than themselves, they're more likely to go along with what the group has to say. Conformity tends to decrease, however, when people are able to respond privately. Research has also shown that conformity decreases if people have support from at least one other individual in the group. Now, one of the major criticisms of Asch's conformity experiments centers on the reasons of why participants chose to conform. According to some critics, individuals may have actually been motivated to avoid conflict rather than an actual desire to conform to the rest of the group. Another criticism is that the result of the experiment in the lab may not generalize to real-world situations. Although, to be honest, I don't know, like, if you're avoiding conflict and you just don't want to speak your mind, like, I get that, but at the end of the day, like, if you know people are wrong, you gotta let them know, like, hey, you're wrong. I don't care how many of you guys are there. Like, if you're just giving out wrong information, you gotta let them know. You gotta stand on that. So I don't know, I can't relate, but we're moving on to the last one of this tier, the Marshmallow Experiments. In the 1960s, a Stanford professor named Walter Mischel began conducting a series of important psychological studies. During his experiments, Mischel and his team tested hundreds of children, most of them around the ages of 4 and 5 years old, and revealed what is now believed to be one of the most important characteristics for success in health, work, and life in general. The experiment began by bringing each child into a private room, sitting them down on a chair, and placing a marshmallow on the table in front of them. At this point, the researcher offers a deal to the child. The researcher tells the child that he was going to leave the room, and that if the child does not eat the marshmallow while he's gone, then he would be rewarded with a second marshmallow when he returns. However, if the child decided to eat the first one before the researcher came back, then they would not get a second marshmallow. So the choice was simple: one treat right now or 2 treats later. Basically a patience test. Now, as you can imagine, the footage of the children waiting alone in the room was rather entertaining. Some kids jumped up and ate the first marshmallow as soon as the researcher closed the door. Others wiggled and bounced and scooted in their chairs as they tried to restrain themselves, but eventually gave in to the temptation a few minutes later. And finally, a few of the children did manage to wait the entire time out, so good shit to them. Published in 1972, this popular study became known as the Marshmallow Experiment, but it wasn't the treat that made it famous. The interesting part came years later. As the years rolled on and the children grew up, the researchers conducted follow-up studies and tracked each child's progress in a number of areas. What they found was surprising. The children who were willing to delay gratification and waited to receive the second marshmallow ended up having higher SAT scores, lower levels of substance abuse, lower likelihood of obesity, better responses to stress, better social skills as reported by their parents, and generally better scores in a range of other life measures. But a new study published recently has cast doubt onto the whole concept. The researchers are Tyler Watts, Greg Duncan, and Hanoan Kwan. Now, Watts and his colleagues were skeptical of the findings. The original results were based on studies that included fewer than 90 children, and they were all enrolled in a preschool on Stanford's campus. In restaging the experiment, Watts and his colleagues thus adjusted the experimental design in important ways. The researchers used a sample that was much larger, more than 900 children, and also more representative of the general population in terms of race, ethnicity, and parents' education. The researchers also, when analyzing their test results, controlled for certain factors, such as the income of a child's household. That might explain why the child's ability to delay gratification in their long-term success. Like, obviously, if you need to pay the bills, like, you can't wait. And ultimately, the new study finds limited support for the idea that being able to delay gratification leads to better outcomes. So, that's good for me. I'm impatient. Instead, it suggests that the capacity to hold out for a second marshmallow is shaped in large by part of a child's social and economic background, and in turn, that background, not the ability to delay gratification, is what is behind the kid's long-term success. Pretty crazy shit, but we're moving on to the last one, the Halo Experiments of 1977. University of Michigan professor Richard Nisbin and Timothy Wilson were interested in following up a study from 50 years earlier on a concept known as the halo effect. In the 1920s, American psychologist Edward Thorndike researched a phenomenon in the US military that showed cognitive bias. The halo effect is a type of cognitive bias in which our overall impressions of how a person influences how we feel and think about their character. Essentially, your overall impression of a person, like he is nice, impacts your evaluations of that person's specific traits. Like, if he's nice, he must also be smart. Perceptions of a single trait can carry over to how people perceive other aspects of that person. Now, one great example of the halo effect in action is our overall impression of celebrities. Since people perceive them as attractive, successful, and often likable, they also tend to be seen as intelligent, kind, and funny, which we all know is not true. In 1977, Nisbet and Wilson tested the halo effect using 118 college students, 62 males and 56 females. Students were divided into two groups and were asked to evaluate a male Belgian teacher who spoke English with a heavy accent. Participants were shown one of two videotaped interviews with the teacher on a television monitor. The first interview showed the teacher interacting cordially with the students. The second interview showed the teacher behaving inhospitably. The subjects were then asked to rate the teacher's physical appearance, mannerisms, and accent on an 8-point scale from appealing to irritating. Imagine just getting labeled irritating. That would suck. Oh my god. Nisbet and Wilson found that on physical appearance alone, 70% of the subjects rated the teacher as appealing when he was being respectful and irritating when he was cold. When the teacher was rude, 80% of the subjects rated his accent as irritating, as compared to nearly 50% when he was being nice. The updated study on the halo effect shows that cognitive bias isn't exclusive to a military environment. Cognitive bias can get in the way of making the correct decision, whether it's during a job interview or deciding whether to buy a product that's been endorsed by a celebrity we admire, or tons of other examples. Okay, and that was it for the sky. We haven't even hit the tip of the iceberg yet, so these were like the more common known. If you went to college, if you do the psychology route, I'm sure you know about all of these, but trust me, next few videos are about to start getting crazy. Some of these got mind control experiments, MK Ultra, a bunch of different stuff. But anyways, if you got this far, I appreciate you. I'm releasing, I don't know if it's not even loading right now, but I'm releasing the lost locations thing all in one iceberg, one big iceberg. It's about to be like 4 hours, so if you can watch that. But anyways, if you got this far, like, subscribe, all that stuff. You see Miggy in the back. I had to cover her while she was cleaning herself, you know what I mean? Nasty. But anyways, we love you. We'll catch you later. Stay dangerous, stay safe, all that. Peace.